Welcome everybody to our session. You know the name of it, I don't need to say it to you. My name is Michael Visontay and I'm the commissioning editor of the Jewish Independent. I'm moderating the session today with our three guests, Dassi, Erlich, Manny and Anne Manne. We're going to be speaking for about a half an hour and then after that we'll throw the room open to questions from you from the audience. Just a short introduction to the session today. When we learn about abuse or violence perpetrated against children, it brings out our deepest feelings of revulsion. They're too young, they're too defenceless. While the news is in our heads, we're sickened by the exploitation of such a huge power imbalance. But for the rest of us, after the news is turned off, the habits and challenges of our own lives rise up to demand our attention. But for the victims and the survivors of child sexual abuse, there is no such respite. The betrayal of trust by someone whose age, culture, and institution gives them enormous power over children has lifelong consequences. Today we're going to be talking about the issues and the challenges that are thrown up by what I've just said with our three guests. A short introduction. Dassi, who's next to me, her name probably doesn't need any introduction to you. She's a lobbyist, she's a campaigner and advocate for child sexual abuse survivors, and she is the author of her memoir, In Bad Faith, published this year. Manny is the host of PTSD Nation, a podcast series addressing the issues associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. Manny is a survivor of child sexual abuse and has founded a number of organisations to deal with the issue, most notably Voices CSA. He's been an outspoken advocate here and overseas for more than a decade, and he is the author of a memoir, Who Gave You Permission? Over on the left is Anne Manne. Anne is a writer, essayist and social philosopher, a former columnist for The Australian and The Age. She's written many essays about contemporary culture, especially for the monthly magazine. Her books include Motherhood, So This Is Life, The Life of I, and a quarterly essay, Love and Money, The Family and the Free Market. And she has written a book called Crimes of the Cross, the Anglican Pedophile Network of Newcastle. So we have here the perspectives of two survivors and someone who has written the story of a survivor who's central to a larger institutional culture and cover-up. So the subject we're going to discuss today is a grim one, I think most people would agree. But before we start, I would like to start on an uplifting note. And that is that this past week, a man called Velbel Serebransky, who was one of the two men who abused Manny when he was a child, was committed for trial and will stand trial on an offence that he committed in 1987 or 1988, 37, perhaps 36 years ago. And for Manny and for the people on the panel, and I think for everyone in this room, that should be a source of tremendous vindication and faith in the justice system and a sense of some sort of natural justice, however delayed it has been. So, I'll start with Manny and Dassi. Your stories are well known because you chose to speak out publicly and fight back against the people and the institutions responsible for your abuse. The media took up these stories and the public engaged with them. But when the fight for justice was resolved, ended, or was otherwise suspended, the media switches off and moves on to another injustice. But you can't just move on. Can you tell us what it's like when the spotlight is turned off? What that means for how you live? Dassi, would you like to start?
That's a very good question. I can't 100% say that the spotlight has completely moved on quite yet, so I haven't quite got a sense of what that looks like. I mean, I'm here today, I've been book touring, but in some ways I've actually been really grateful to not be fronting the media day after day and having the person that abused me constantly in my thoughts, thinking about how I'm going to talk about that there was such a sense, and even now I can look back and see there was such a sense of internal struggle going on throughout the campaign years, throughout the trial. And I was so much in a survival space. To be able to look back at that time now from a completely different space, from a healed space, there are a lot of ways that I have been able to move on and enjoy life in a way that wasn't possible before.
Manny?
For me, it's being part of a broader journey. I started the advocacy and spoke out about my personal experience in 2011. And initially, I remember there was a lot of empowerment, and it just felt that I was regaining my strength, my autonomous nature, and everything, regaining it. And then you go through periods where, yes, the limelight was on, and a couple of documentaries, and there were highly advertised court cases, and then the Royal Commission. But then exactly when the lights are dim, we still need to live within ourselves. And one of the most important things I've learned, and it took me a few years to learn, is the concept of self-care. Because we're not only dealing with our own personal trauma that we endured as children, but add on top of that, as advocates, vicarious trauma, which is another term I learned, when you are constantly being exposed to other people's trauma, and if you're not being treated properly or you're not treating yourself properly, that trauma can build up and eventually also explode if you don't address it. So you can't keep your finger off the pulse, because it is an ongoing process of self-care, self-improvement. In a broad sense, I would say that today I am pretty much in the best situation that I've been, at least internally. It's taken a whole lot of persistence and difficult work. There's no doubt. I mean, I've spoken in my book about my challenges with suicide ideation, even, and those difficult topics. So I've been at the lowest, but I do feel strong enough that I'm not going to get down to that level ever again. Therapy, physical activity, for each person it's different, but critical self-care.
So it's one thing for you to be taking care of yourself and to work out how you want to present to the world and what matters. But how do the people in your life, your family and your friends and your supporters, how do they engage with you now? Does it change after the fight has gone out of the spotlight to the extent that it has? What are your relationships with them like? What are those challenges?
I think for the most part, quite a lot of my friends and family are just happy that there's not so much almost chaos or drama in my life anymore. And for the most part, there's just a sense of normalcy. So they've appreciated seeing me enjoy life away from that space. I don't feel that in any way it has changed. Obviously, as a survivor and as a public advocate, people that have gone through similar circumstances draw together and find empowerment and a sense of community from coming together. And there's always that little bit of, I think, a struggle for people that haven't received justice, or looking at my story and seeing that I have achieved justice. And sadly, that is so uncommon and so rare. So that's something that I find is something that's spoken about in friendships and with people that are close to me. But in every other way, people are just happy to see me in a good space in my life.
Manny?
Dassi said that she doesn't have to deal with drama. I'm one of 17 kids, so there's always drama. My older sister's actually here, by the way, and her husband, which is lovely to see. So I do have plenty of support, which has been great, but it's not quite as simple as that, because when I did go public, it did tear the family apart. There are some who are still in the ultra-orthodox community. Many of my siblings have classmates and close friends whose parents or family members I was compelled to out in one way or another, whether they were people involved in cover-ups, in the intimidation my family and I endured. So it's not quite black and white. It's something that I'm still navigating. I would say there's still, for example, one particular sibling that I'm not talking to still as a result of what happened. Others have apologised. There's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings sometimes. So it's really important to communicate with our family members and try to express where it is that we are holding, because it's difficult for those who have endured this type of abuse and speak about it later and have to deal with all those. If you haven't been through it, it's really difficult to understand what PTSD is, post-traumatic stress disorder. So it really is important to have that dialogue and conversation. But then again, sometimes it's also you want to protect yourself and not necessarily feel like sharing everything with everyone at every stage. So again, part of the self-care that I was referring to before, I think it's just as critical with that is to have a support network, family and friends that you can trust, that you can be open with, and ultimately supporting you through your journey as well.
So, Anne, I'd like to go to you now. Your book about the Anglican Church in Newcastle is about a corruption and a culture of concealment that spread right through the city, through the institution of the church. But you've written a story, I guess, with the spine of a survivor like Dassi and Manny, a man called Steve Smith. I wonder if you could just tell the room a little bit about that, because they're more familiar with the other stories, and give us an insight into this man, Steve Smith's state of mind now, how he has negotiated his experience.
So the word Anglicanism often inspires a kind of complacency or ease, or the Vicar's Tea Party and Lamingtons and safety, and it's not a scary institution. It also, especially in Newcastle, was not...
No hands, no hands.
That's the Newcastle network. They're here to sabotage. They did a lot of sabotage. So it was the surface of the Anglican Church meant that the surface appearance meant that they were able to fly under the radar for a long time. And so the Royal Commission is often credited to Joanne McCarthy in Newcastle, who was writing, however, about the Catholics. And so there's very little attention to the Anglican Church, which was, according to a professional standards director, which means someone who's cleaning up sexual misconduct by priests, who worked for both the Catholics and the Anglicans. He said it was worse in the Anglicans because they were more organised and because it was a network who enabled others. Sometimes there were multiple perpetrators at particular venues, but even where they were not abusing together, where they knew someone was abusing, that was a safe person to leave in that position. All the committees were stacked with two leading pedophiles. Peter Rushton was one, an archdeacon, and the most powerful man in the diocese, Graham Lawrence, who was the dean of the cathedral, second in command. But he was really the one who everyone agreed ran the diocese. And they were on every disciplinary committee. They were networkers. They were political operators and penetrated the political power of the city. To move to Steve Smith, he was abused terribly, extremely, from 1971 to 1975. In that era, people forget, but the main denomination in Australia, the largest, was actually the Anglicans at that time. The Church of England, as David Marr says in his book, was the established church for the British colonial, when Australia was, when they came out here, that was the church. So it's the establishment church. It's much more powerful than people realise. And it's, just to give you an example of that, John Howard was an Anglican, no one remarked on it. Whereas when Tony Abbott was a Catholic, everyone said, oh my God, he's a Catholic, So it's not just the sectarianism between Catholics and the Anglican Church or the Protestants, but this enmeshment with power came to be a very important part of Steve's story. When he finally disclosed to his mother, it was at the end of 5 years of abuse, and he felt unable to disclose in all that time. He said that the priest was as close to God as you got. He came from a devout family in many ways before the priest came to be the parish priest. It was a happy childhood, an idyllic, working class, poor, but an idyllic childhood. And then his life changed and he was cast into a subterranean world of sexual perversion in which he was an object. And he had no idea how to get out of it. To give you an idea, it wasn't just that he was groomed, it wasn't just that the priest would threaten him, but he knew from another boy who was abused by the same priest in his parish that when the parents complained, that family, which was once a premier family down the front row with the best frocks and the best position in the church, were just jettisoned. They were ostracised, they were excommunicated, effectively. So Steve thought, that will happen to my family if I say a word. So these forms of silencing, and then there were inner forms of silencing where the priest would say to Steve, God sent you to me. Most people were part of a church, but particularly the Anglican church. So powerful, you weren't allowed to have a building which was higher than that Anglican church. So then it was Steve's struggle over it still goes on today, but over 50 years to call that church to account, to get them to recognise the harm that had been done. And it had many phases, and during that period he was often broken. I call him a bare-knuckle fighter because he would be broken, he'd be on the canvas, but he'd get up again and have another go at trying to get them to face what had happened. And it was really only from 1975, many disclosures, many efforts, including a trial which was corrupted by the church itself. Only in 2010 did he get an apology from the bishop. And then his trajectory of getting more and more apologies. I keep a little record of all the apologies he's now got from people in Newcastle and around Australia. And he has become a leader in the survivors network, and he's been a great advocate. But at the same time, I want to just report what he says, which is that he always reminds me that there is something good in every human being that we want to hear that Manny and Dassi are doing well and Steve Smith's doing well. That's a good thing because people care. But there's also something whereby, as Steve says, he knows the people who are at the bottom of the cliffs in Newcastle. They need to be remembered too. And also I think we have to push against the idea that survivors are kind of obliged to give those who are not survivors a pleasing trajectory. If they need to go back into psychiatric care, if they need to go downwards and collapse, if they need to, wherever they need to go, we must stay with them and be their supporters and companions, that family, community. So I'm just saying there's an ethics of this kind of disclosures reception, which is lifelong, and we never let it go.
Yes, I think that's very well put, and that goes to really the issue here about when it happens to a child, it stays with them, not even for better or worse, but for their life, and they deal with it, and sometimes they deal with it better or sometimes not. I'll go back to Dassi here. Have you been able to forgive or find any sense of closure in terms of your experiences?
You know, I've actually been asked that question quite a few times at different events. What about forgiveness? And my usual answer is I've learned to forgive myself, and it's, you know, that's something that I've worked on. I've carried a lot of shame. If only I hadn't done this, why had this happened? If only I had acted differently. You know, the guilt, the shame. And I've just thought that's the journey I want to work on, that idea of forgiving myself. But like, as I've, you know, been re-questioned about that, and it's made me think a little bit more. And I've thought, would I forgive Malka Laifa? I just don't I don't care enough about her to want to go through the process of forgiving her. So it's not something that I feel that I need for a sense of closure. It's just not that important to me. She's not such a, and I've been very privileged to have had the opportunity to get justice. She's not that person in my life that I find that I need to do that work with anymore.
I mean, do you find that you have, and I'll put it to the others, you've been put under an undue pressure to consider whether you forgive, even with questions like mine right now?
No, I think that's it's a curiosity for people, and I can imagine, and I know, and I've met a lot of survivors that carry a lot of hatred or a lot of feelings towards their abuser, and maybe forgiveness for them is something that they need to kind of work through to get to that space where they can understand that it's really about forgiving themselves. But maybe I've had the opportunity to do that work, and she's just not that important to me anymore.
Right. Manny?
Most survivors and victims of child sexual abuse never obtain any justice, and that's just a fact. Most don't go to the police, and those few cases that do go to the police, the vast majority of those don't proceed to trial, and those few that do proceed to trial doesn't necessarily get insufficient evidence and all of that, because often it's historical cases. At the same time, I'm sitting here after holding to account my second abuser, David Cyprus. He sat in jail, holding to account the Yeshiva Centre civil case against them and through the Royal Commission. And last week, as you noted before, I'm now holding to account my first abuser. I feel blessed. I feel grateful. It's been a significant cost to pursuing justice, and it was interesting, your choice of words earlier when you were introducing, you were talking about justice, even if it's not complete and all of that. The reality is, one of the reasons that people don't get justice in those types of cases because of the process. It is not just exhausting, not just draining, but impacts us to the core. So, but having said that, for me, I feel like I'm heading towards closure, whatever exactly that means. Essentially, to me, what it means is that I've done everything in my power to hold those who harmed me and others to account in the best way that I can, and at the same time, ensuring the safety of our community. If there's one thing that still riles me up, and even there's anger at that, the issue of accountability is probably one of the most important words and values for many victims and survivors. And that accountability doesn't just translate to holding your perpetrator to account, because around that perpetrator, there are often many other people who facilitate it in one way or another, cover it up. And for me, one of the biggest issues has been, if I think about the leaders in our community, in the Jewish community here in Australia, there are the former head of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. We were talking about apologies before. I've also thankfully received many apologies from rabbis, rabbinates, different groups and leaders. But there's one person who's refused to apologise for the incredible harm he caused me and others and my family, Danny Lamb. And he's been a community leader for a long time, and I know he has a lot of supporters. He does a lot of good work for our community. But what that man did, you can see, you can feel my body language, angers. And it doesn't anger me what he did. What angers me more is that I've already said this publicly so many times in various forums, and that man has never been held to account in any way. And from my perspective, on my to-do list forever, and I'm trying to let go of it more and more, but I try to go back to it, refer to it once a year, once every couple of years, just so the community doesn't forget who these people are. And if I mention Danny Lamb, the other person is Chaim Tzvi Groner, Rabbi Groner, the son of, this is someone after the Royal Commission at the Yeshiva Centre, after they were all forced to resign and they did a whole restructure and whatnot, and then they placed Rabbi Chaim Tzvi Groner as a life trustee of the new structure. So what message does that send? And again, I'm not looking to blame anyone, but it's about accountability And through the accountability, you're also able to see change. You can see that this community, that this leadership here, that they're actually aware of what needs to happen. As the Royal Commission itself said, it starts from the top.
Yep.
And if that message is sent to victims and survivors that, hey, this guy was there for decades while abuse, cover-ups, intimidation were going on, what does that say about the institution? So there's still a long way to go. But again, back to the question about the closure, I feel like it's as close as I'm ever going to get.
Yeah. So, Manny, you've touched there on one of the sort of classic experiences of crime, which is not just the person who commits the crime, but the response of other people, whether they are accountable, whether they're open or whether they try and conceal, and then they make it worse and there are secondary and tertiary crimes. So that's been a very big thing in the Anglican Church in Newcastle in your book, Anne. Do you have a sense from Steve and also your own observation about the church about whether he has been able to still engage with that community, that institution, and whether it has reformed itself in any way?
Well, firstly on the question of forgiveness, Steve and I had a lot of discussions about this. I know that my hackles rise when people start talking about forgiveness, because in my view, only the victim survivor can think about that question, answer it for themselves, and then give it. There should be no pressure from outside. I want to say that in the Christian church, both the Catholics and the Anglicans, forgiveness was used in a way to continue the abusing. So Catholic priests would go and give confession, and someone would say something or other, and they'd do some little penance. And there's a book by Marie Keenan about Catholic priests where she interviewed a lot of the offenders, and they would admit that it freed them to go back and abuse. In the Anglican Church, this central figure in the pedophile network, Graham Lawrence, he was an icon around Newcastle. He's charming and everyone loved him. He was very popular, charismatic, dominated people, very popular at the Newcastle Club and all the rest of it. When he was found to have abused a child in the 1980s, the whole town divided. A very small section on the side of the abuse victim and a huge section, including members of the Labor Party and Liberal Party, and just screaming rage on behalf of this Graham Lawrence. And people would come up to the bishop who had himself been, Greg Thompson, who 2014 to 17, he'd been abused by an earlier bishop, Bishop Chevel, in Newcastle. So he knew all about it, but he was giving apologies to the survivors, and there was rage, absolute rage at what he was doing. There were death threats, not just to him, but to the survivors. And people would come up to him and say, why can't you just forgive Graham and his partner, Greg, who was also abusing this boy simultaneously? Why don't you just forgive him? And as I said to Bishop Farron, who was just, before that period, started to do something about child sexual abuse. This is like Father Christmas handing out lollies at Christmas. Or maybe confetti at a wedding. It's just tossed out. And so the forgiveness is actually enabling perpetrators to continue. Because unless you put really strict protocols against anyone who was accused, even if later they are proven to be innocent, you are allowing other children to be at risk. And there are numerous cases, obviously in the Royal Commission that came out, in the cases of these books, where other children become victims because of this shabby, corrupted, shallow idea of forgiveness being granted by someone in the confessional box or by another male authority figure. It's what my daughter, who's a feminist philosophy, calls himpathy, disproportionate sympathy for the male perpetrator. And it's spot on.
Thank you.
And by the way, Steve doesn't forgive his perpetrator,
Right.
because he never faced it.
I didn't use the word forgiveness at all, so I think I just want to address that very briefly. Like Dassi, what she said resonated with me in terms of forgiveness in relation to my perpetrators. It doesn't even come into the lexicon for me because I don't need to waste my time. But for me, it's accountability. They've done it in some cases. Velvo Sobransky, I feel sorry for the man. in some ways, a sad case, someone who actually believes that a child can consent. He still thinks that today, as we saw in the video footage. So he takes two to tango, according to this man he's almost 60 years old, and he still feels that. So it's not about forgiveness. For me, there is an important element in forgiveness, and I've always, as I mentioned before, I've received countless apologies over the years, and whenever anyone sends me an apology, it's helpful, and it's a release, and I will always forgive, because, as I said, it's about accountability and acknowledgement, and once that person has come to the realisation that they've caused significant harm and they've taken a difficult step of taking responsibility for their terrible actions by apologising, to me it's a positive reflection on that person, and I think it helps all parties move forward.
Yeah. Just before we go to the floor for questions, just one quick question to Dassi. Dassi, your book is your story, but it is also built around the experiences of your two sisters. Can you just quickly tell us about whether there were any complications or added factors involved when you're telling your story, but it is intertwined with that of siblings?
I mean, I have my sister Nicole here with me today, and it was particularly around writing my childhood, because we had never spoken out publicly about our childhood, and I did write quite extensively in the book about our younger years and the abuse that we suffered at home. That was something that all of my siblings had to kind of come to a reckoning about what they wanted about their lives out there in public, because at the end of the day, that was their childhood as well. And when it came to the later years, which we call the campaign years, the campaign and the trial, and obviously those were, my sisters and I went through those experiences together, and I'm incredibly grateful that we went through that together, because there were times I felt that I would have not made it through without their support. We all had our own experiences of that. So my sisters could write a book and write the exact same journey and have a completely different experience. We were all coming to it from our own perspectives, our own way of being, our own way of living, our own belief systems. But we were there for each other. And of course they checked and were okay with everything. And I would have not published anything without them giving me the all good to go ahead with it.
Okay, thank you. All right, look, we'll go to the floor now to take questions from you. I think, have we got any roving microphones? At the back there? Sorry, yes, you. Yeah, yeah. There's a microphone coming.
This is probably more for Dassi and Manny. Did you find any element of healing through writing your own story?
Not while I was writing it. That was incredibly difficult and way more difficult than I thought that it would be. But afterwards, knowing that my story had been written about in so many different ways by so many people, and being able to choose for myself what was important for me to share and why I was sharing that, and then being able to look back and read my book and look at my history and say, wow, I've survived all of that. I've got to this point. And I remember, going back to what we were talking about, that pleasing trajectory, I was right at the end of writing my book, and I had a couple of weeks to write the last few chapters. And at the time, we just had finished trial, and I was in a psychiatric hospital. And the publisher said to me, you kind of need to leave the reader with a little bit of hope. And I said, I'm in a psychiatric hospital. How on earth am I supposed to write that? But I found a way that resonated with me, that wasn't in any way inauthentic, which in my way felt like that was the way forward. And now, a year on, I can say I'm so grateful that I have got to that space. And I can look back at that and think, yes, there was such a sense of empowerment and ownership in being able to write my story, and healing.
For me, I would never classify it as a healing process. For me, it was much more of setting the record straight, because so much had been written and speculated and discussed. And for me, it was my voice sharing my experience and not in anyone else's voice and words. So that was particularly empowering. Also, though, at the time of writing, about 2016, so it was a few years ago, I was also struggling then. I was basically at my lowest period. It was after the Royal Commission. So I just, left Australia with my young family. We were living in France. Didn't know where we were going to live. All we knew is that we had to leave Australia. Almost, felt that we were thrown out of Australia by the way some of the community was dealing. So my mindset and the intent were very different, basically. So. Yes.
Microphone. Oh, sorry. You've got to. We'll come to you afterwards. Yep.
Hi, everyone. As a psychiatrist, I think the question of forgiveness comes out of an anxiety often, an anxiety and a concern that, we really have to manage anger. I think the picture with seeing Manny and Dassi, seeing you healthy, I'm going to put it quite simply from really a clinical.
Sorry.
Managing anger's something very human. There's a fascinating Torah story of a child who's the prey being Isaac in the binding by his father Abraham. There's lots of deep mysteries to that. But I think one picture I might share that I've sort of created, I guess, as an analogy for a lot of patients that I've treated with childhood sexual abuse is think of anger as a pipe. And we can try and block the pipe, which might be like a sort of perfunctory forgiveness. Oh, there's no anger, I'll forgive and block the pipe. We might promote the pipe, kind of rabble-rousing inflammation. But really the task, I think, is to keep the pipe intact. Pretty simple. And when Manny mentioned the idea of self-care, one of the most common problems or sequelae of childhood sexual abuse in grown-ups, adults, is addictions. And the addiction itself is a displacement into an area of helplessness, further shame, a kind of attempt to manage anger.
Excuse me for a second. You're supposed to ask a question.
But the question is, if that pipe analogy is useful, I'll just sort of leave it with you, that in terms of self-care, you're managing the pipe.
I'll have to think about that analogy a little bit more, but I think, certainly what resonated more for me is certainly how not to treat it, which is not blocking it, not ignoring, which I was used to be a star at that. Just everything's okay, ignore it. I have a medical cannabis and whatnot in different countries, and it's easy, alcohol, and I won't go into all the details, and it's all in the book, but certainly a lot of what you say has resonated with me, definitely.
Can I just say about Steve? Well, first of all, generally, anger can be emotion of health. So particularly in women, we're not meant to be angry, even though we might have a lot to be angry about. We're meant to keep our heads down and smile and all the rest of it. Steve was angry at first and turned that anger inward, and that was very destructive. And as he put it himself, he drank stupid and he drove stupid. He was in the lockup in Newcastle, the old police station, so long that he carved his name in the side of the wall. We had the launch at the lockup, which is now a gallery, and everyone was pointed out that here his name is in the back of the wall. But gradually, when he decided to fight the Anglican Church, that was, as Dassi and Manny have done so courageously, that's channeling the anger in a really creative and productive kind of way. It doesn't mean he didn't collapse. It doesn't mean he didn't at times speed himself up. Even often when I was interviewing him, I noticed he was very tough on himself, which he ought not to have been, but nonetheless, so there was that element. But the anger itself, I don't think we should be so frightened of it. It's upsetting in an interpersonal way, or someone who you're intimate with who's angry with you. But anger can be a sign of health, the first step towards agency, and these are people whose agency has been taken away from them. So Steve said how angry he was. He had a moment at the Royal Commission where a security guard assumed he was on the side of the church and he was looking after Steve and his wife, and he said, why do these people take so long to come forward? Anyway, Rachel, Steve's very lovely wife, who's credible support, she just tensed because she thought, my God, he's going to put him through the wall, you know, because Steve's capable of that. There was a fair bit of that earlier. But instead, Steve just looked at him and quietly explained. He said, have you ever heard of Auschwitz? He said, no expiry date for justice, mate. And so all the time he started to talk about the Holocaust, strangely enough, and that there is never a time when war crimes can be just set aside. There's never a time when a crime like this is too old, no expiry date for justice. And Rachel thought, oh my God, you've changed so much in the time that she'd known him. But that was a creative and productive way of channeling his anger. And so, yeah, but I just want to preserve the survivor's right to be angry.
Yeah. It's a natural human reaction. It's more about what we do with that anger. And that's,
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. So
Just briefly, I don't believe in closure or forgiveness and put in a larger context of the Holocaust. There seems to be so much pressure to forgive and forget and close. And I was just wondering, why do you need to do it? I mean, certain crimes, again, thinking of the Holocaust and then your personal situation, why do you need to forgive? Why do you need to have closure?
That's what my husband Rob said when I raised this question. We have these talks every morning and I raised this question of forgiveness. And he said, so who in this room will forgive Hitler? It was effectively, he was saying there are many occasions when we do not have to forgive. So I agree with your question.
and that's what I said earlier as well. I mean, for me, and Dassi was mentioning that as well, it's not about our perpetrators and forgiveness. There are so many other people who are harmed, and I think there's just that desire from within to not, just to let go of any ill feelings, not even whether it's anger or discomfort. It's just better resolved, and I think ultimately it makes us more peaceful, calm individuals. But certainly I wouldn't say about forgetting. There's forgiveness and forgetting. I would never forget. It's impossible to forget. The day I forget means that I'm either dead or not really living with it properly. But forgiveness is separate.
Yeah.
If only there was a way to forget.
Yes.
All right. You've got the microphone, yes?
I want to go back to a question that both Manny and Dassi answered about writing their own stories. And what was it like for you to write somebody else's story? I'm sure you showed him what you'd written. What was it like to have to tell someone else's story?
I did show it to him. I showed him more or less the final draft and I gave him the full rights, as I explained to him all the way through, because it is quite personal and confronting, but he had to be okay with all of it. And he had the right to pull it out. And if I meant I had to write the book for another year, well, that was okay. So, and by then we had such a relationship of trust, he knew that I was genuine about that offer. So he did read it, and it was confronting. His wife, Rachel, said that he went out and mowed the lawn 3 times. And I'm not surprised, but it was all drawn, you know, from interviews. But in him there was a desperate need to have this story known and told. And so what I did was to kind of open myself to him in a way and allow myself to be the conduit for his story. As far as possible in the first 5 chapters, which are particularly, his story's threaded all the way through, but the first 5 chapters are absolutely about his idyllic childhood, then the abuse, then the breakdown and the aftermath until he begins battling the church. And he found that, he said, empowering, because I'd caught it. There was one passage where I talked about when his mother died and what he felt. So he felt, I think, validated and empowered to have someone come along and write about it. But I also kept the style as congruent with his working class, plain speaking. I love the way he speaks. It's extremely vivid, but nonetheless as consistent with that. And so I think he has found it overall empowering. But he had that right, and that's the thing about, Yeah, so that's how I handle it. And some people like to say, as they're writers, and they're very good writers, but they'll talk about how they felt this or they felt that, and that's part of the way they write about it. But I don't do that. I absent myself, and I'm the conduit for his voice to come forward. And that's how I decided. In this, I might do, if I do a memoir, it's not like that, but in this case, I felt that was how I wanted to do it.
I think we've got time for just one more quick question, and then that'll be it.
Have the institutions in which these abuses occurred changed sufficiently since they occurred?
Happy to jump
The
in.
question was, have the institutions in which these abuses occurred changed sufficiently since?
No.
No, no.
No.
See, with a bit more context for me, there's a significant progress has been made. Whether it's Yeshiva Centre, Adas, other places, but it only came about because it was imposed on them. And that we have to remember that, and that's why there needs to be continued pressure, because many of them are trying to find ways to, again, it's not now a public issue as it was a few years ago, so how can we get away with as much as possible? And that's the disappointing bit. But as the example I gave with Groner, institutions cannot actually sufficiently change if they're still holding on to the past.
Yep.
So an example for the Anglicans is that Archbishop Hollingworth was not defrocked. He should have been defrocked. But instead, he ended up being pressured by the primate, the head of the Anglican Church, to resign. But that was just pathetic. And they didn't even properly listen to survivors' testimony. I've read all of the Hollingworth debacle in the Brisbane diocese, the kind of abuses he let operate, etc. He was an enabler. So, not enough. Steve says, this very plain-speaking, very worldly, sensible man, he says, they're only a bishop away from it happening again. So it's there, but it's precarious.
Yeah. Okay, so look, I think, sorry, we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank our guests today.
Just a reminder, all the books will be available at the hub.
Right, all the books will be available. Yeah. And I'd just like to make the point that these people who are here before you have not just written their book, but certainly in the case of Dassi and Manny, they've shown tremendous bravery and courage over a sustained period of years. Thank you.